In the years preceding Sepp Dietrich's command of an SS Panzer division in open mechanized war, the political and institutional scaffolding for his career had already taken shape. Born in 1892, a First World War veteran of Bavarian artillery, Dietrich entered interwar paramilitary networks and joined the National Socialist movement early, becoming a trusted bodyguard for Adolf Hitler. The Schutzstaffel expanded from a personal guard into a national organization under Heinrich Himmler, with Dietrich placed at the head of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Initially, a guard regiment stationed in Berlin. By 1933 to 1934, the Leibstandarte had grown to regiment strength with infantry, signals, and heavy weapons companies. By 1939, it fielded motor transport, a light artillery battery, and an armoured car detachment, aligning its structure with Wehrmacht infantry regiments while remaining outside the army's chain of command. Germany's rearmament shaped the environment in which the Leibstandarte trained. The Wehrmacht built combined arms doctrine around fast operational penetrations, integrating panzers, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and close air support. The SS formations sought to emulate and compete with the army in mobility and esprit, recruiting intensively and standardizing training on small unit tactics, marksmanship, and fieldcraft. Political selection and loyalty to the regime remained central. Officers advanced not only by technical skill, but through demonstrated alignment with National Socialist goals. Publicly, the Leibstandarte appeared as a ceremonial guard and elite formation. Privately, it was tasked to be combat-capable and politically dependable. The regime's consolidation of power blurred boundaries between policing and warfare. The SS encompassed the Waffen-SS, field troops, and the SS police and security apparatus. Jurisdictional lines mattered. The Wehrmacht answered to the High Command, OKW/OKH, and applied military law. The SS answered to Himmler with its own courts and political mandates. In occupied territories after 1939, cooperation and rivalry coexisted. Army units required security forces for rear area control, while SS and police leaders pursued ideological directives. This dual structure, military necessity alongside political enforcement, set preconditions for both battlefield performance and criminal actions, depending on local command relationships, orders received, and the presence or absence of effective legal oversight. The Leibstandarte's early campaigns established its reputation. In September 1939, elements operated in Poland alongside Army Corps, conducting motorized advances and mopping up operations behind panzer thrusts. In May-June 1940, during the campaign in France and the Low Countries, it served under Army control in mobile operations through Belgium and northern France, receiving additional anti-tank guns and motor transport. After the Balkans campaign in April 1941, the regiment was upgraded. By mid-1941, it was a reinforced motorized brigade, and by 1942 to 1943, it reorganized as a Panzer Grenadier Division, and then the 1st SS Panzer Division. These structural changes brought battalion-level artillery, a panzer regiment with medium tanks, armoured engineers, self-propelled anti-aircraft, and improved signal and logistics units. The intended effect was to field an all-weather, high-tempo formation capable of independent action within a corps. The geopolitical context shaped how such units were used. German strategy balanced short campaign expectations with long supply lines. In the east, the invasion of the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941 created a front exceeding 1,500 kilometers, where panzer groups sought deep encirclements. Intelligence estimates in Berlin and Army Group headquarters initially forecast Soviet collapse after frontier battles. By late 1941, reports acknowledged larger Soviet reserves, worsening weather, and rail conversion delays. SS and Army formations competed for fuel, ammunition, and repair capacity. By early 1943, a typical SS Panzer division aimed at a paper strength of roughly 17,000 to 19,000 men, with a Panzer regiment fielding several dozen Panzer III and Panzer IVs, and later Panthers, 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments on trucks or half-tracks, and divisional artillery of 105mm and 150mm howitzers. Actual strengths varied, often falling below authorized totals due to attrition. Political guidance also shaped rules of engagement. The invasion eastward brought the Commissar Order and related directives that authorized the summary handling of political officers and facilitated harsh anti-partisan operations. Army commanders varied in enforcement. Some protested or mitigated, others transmitted the orders. Socialist leaders were expected to execute ideological instructions without hesitation. In practice, overlapping authorities, Army Field Police, SD detachments, Order Police battalions, security divisions, introduced ambiguity over responsibility. Civilians in contested zones, particularly in Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia, experienced requisition, evacuation, and reprisals as front lines moved. Partisan activity, supply interdiction, and intelligence collection by Soviet organs produced a reciprocal cycle. German rear area security demanded harsher measures. Harsh measures increased local resistance. Public sentiment at home contrasted with frontline realities. German propaganda presented SS field units as disciplined shock troops whose courage compensated for shortages, while Soviet media depicted them as instruments of occupation policy, no different from punitive police formations. At the tactical level, however, divisional war diaries, Army Corps logs, and Soviet operational summaries often recorded the same engagements with different emphases. German sources tracked fuel allotments, march rates, and tank readiness. Soviet counterparts noted depth of defences, availability of anti-tank guns, and artillery expenditure. Where a German report might register a clearing of a village to secure road junctions, a Soviet or local account might detail burnings or executions. The divergence in documentation styles would later matter when military records and criminal evidence were compared. Dietrich's personal position within this system was unusual. He held field commands and enjoyed direct access to Hitler, bypassing typical army promotion paths. His reputation among SS rank and file derived from perceived decisiveness and willingness to be present near the point of contact. Among army professionals, opinions ranged from respect for his drive to criticism of lax staff work or inadequate attention to logistics. The Leibstandarte, as it transitioned into the 1st SS Panzer Division, accumulated battle experience from mobile encirclements to urban fighting. The same units also operated in rear areas where anti-partisan sweeps and interrogations occurred under security policy frameworks. The record thus combined combat effectiveness metrics, kilometers advanced, prisoners captured, tanks knocked out, with entries on hostage-taking reprisals and enforcement of ideological orders. By 1943 to 1944, the broader war environment had tightened constraints. German industrial output increased in absolute terms, but faced Allied bombing, fuel scarcity, and transport disruption. The Waffen-SS, including Dietrich's division and later army-level commands, received priority in some equipment allocations, yet endured increasing shortages in others, notably aviation fuel for close air support and spare parts for Panzers. Intelligence appreciations shifted. On the Eastern Front, Soviet tank brigades and artillery divisions amassed densities capable of breaking through. In the West, Allied air supremacy forced movements to night and forests. These pressures formed the backdrop for later operations in Ukraine and the Ardennes, where the question of tactical skill would be assessed alongside compliance with the laws of war. The preconditions were therefore dual. A maturation of German mobile doctrine and SS organizational growth placed Dietrich at the head of a powerful armoured formation. Simultaneously, The legal political framework and overlapping jurisdictions created circumstances in which crimes against prisoners and civilians could occur and be rationalized as security measures. Understanding how contemporaries differentiated soldierly honor from criminal action requires following both strands: combat operations as recorded in unit logs and after-action reports, and policies and orders that governed behavior in occupied territories and toward captives, before tracing the specific episodes at Kharkov in 1943 and the Ardennes in 1944, and the judicial reckoning that followed. When the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler entered the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941, it did so as a mobile motorized brigade under the EUSS Motorized Corps, assigned to Army Group South. The operational plan for Operation Barbarossa envisioned a rapid destruction of Soviet forces west of the Dnieper River. The German 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist advanced toward Kiev through western Ukraine. The Leibstandarte followed in exploitation roles, sealing pockets and clearing resistance. Its units, equipped with light and medium trucks, motorcycle infantry, and a small armoured detachment of captured French tanks, advanced in columns behind Panzer spearheads. By August, it had participated in the encirclement battles at Uman and later at Dnipropetrovsk, facing Soviet formations from the southwestern front. Field reports and war diaries from this period note a dual pattern of combat and occupation. German operational orders demanded speed and logistical security. At the same time, directives from the Reichsführer SS and OKW authorized the suppression of partisans and the execution of political officers. The Leibstandarte's reports from August-September 1941 refer to cleansing actions in villages near Kherson and Mykolaiv. Soviet accounts describe entire settlements burned following suspected partisan attacks. Command jurisdiction was shared. Army rear commands sought order. SS units were tasked with ideological enforcement. The line between combat and reprisal blurred as the front expanded into the vast Ukrainian steppe. The winter of 1941 to 1942 exposed the limits of German mobility. Dietrich's formation, reduced by frostbite and attrition, was pulled back for rest and refitting in France. There, in 1942, it began conversion into a Panzer Grenadier division. Training emphasized combined arms coordination, infantry, artillery, engineers, and armor maneuvering together. By the beginning of 1943, the division counted roughly 18,000 men, including a new panzer regiment of 2 battalions. Tank strength fluctuated around 80 to 100 serviceable vehicles, mainly Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns. The division's heavy artillery and flak units were reinforced with self-propelled guns to match Red Army firepower. The Waffen-SS leadership promoted the Leibstandarte, along with Das Reich and Totenkopf, as a motorized striking force independent from traditional Army Corps structures. Dietrich, commanding the Leibstandarte since its inception, retained a distinctive leadership style. Contemporary accounts, both German and Allied, noted his directness, use of simple field language, and preference to lead from forward command posts. Within the Waffen-SS hierarchy, his personal loyalty to Hitler gave him prestige and access. His operational expertise, however, was shaped more by intuition and battlefield presence than by staff training. Army officers cooperating with his units described him as energetic but occasionally undisciplined in paperwork and supply management. To the troops, he was Sepp, the approachable commander who shared risks. These traits built an image of charisma, later amplified by propaganda, which contrasted sharply with his limited formal education. The Kharkov counteroffensive of early 1943 became the stage where Dietrich's division gained both operational recognition and deeper entanglement in the complexities of modern warfare. After the Soviet breakthrough at Stalingrad, the Red Army launched broad offensives toward Belgorod and Kharkov, pressing exhausted German formations back. SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser, including the Leibstandarte des Reich and Totenkopf, was transferred from France to the Eastern Front in February 1943. Between 19 February and 15 March, the Corps counterattacked south and west of Kharkov in coordinated armour infantry manoeuvres that restored a continuous front. Leibstandarte's Panzer Regiment, supported by assault guns and artillery, executed enveloping movements around Bogodukov and Merefa, while Totenkopf closed the encirclement near Kharkov proper. By mid-March, the city was retaken at high cost on both sides. Combat records show the scale. The SS Panzer Corps fielded approximately 350 operational tanks and assault guns. By the end of the offensive, fewer than half remained serviceable. Soviet units from the Voronezh front reported the loss of over 20,000 men in the sector. The Leibstandarte's casualty lists for February-March 1943 recorded around 4,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The operational success re-established German morale after Stalingrad, and German propaganda celebrated the counterstroke as proof of renewed striking power. Yet behind the official narrative lay disturbing parallel reports, summary executions of captured Soviet troops identified as commissars or partisans, and punitive actions in nearby villages accused of aiding the Red Army. Soviet post-war investigations documented the destruction of several rural settlements in Kharkiv Oblast during this period, attributing responsibility to units under SS command. For the German side, these actions were rationalized as anti-partisan warfare. Orders from higher headquarters, both SS and Army, permitted the shooting of irregular combatants out of hand. The Waffen-SS formations, composed of political volunteers and career soldiers alike, operated within that legal grey zone. Diaries of ordinary soldiers from the Leibstandarte reveal an ambivalence, fatigue and disillusion, alongside conviction of fighting a total ideological war. Soviet survivors' testimonies collected decades later describe the same encounters as massacres of unarmed civilians, women and children. The disparity in perspectives underscores how, by 1943, the front in the east had fused conventional and irregular warfare into one continuum of destruction. Following Kharkov, the Leibstandarte was withdrawn again to Belgium for rest and refitting. Its reorganization into a full panzer division brought new equipment, including Panther tanks and heavier self-propelled guns. The division's manpower included both veterans and new drafts from Germany and occupied Europe. Training emphasized rapid armored thrusts, night marches, and cooperation with Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft. Strategically, Germany prepared for the anticipated Allied invasion in the west while maintaining the Eastern Front. In this dual preparation, SS divisions became mobile reserves capable of transfer between theatres, reflecting the regime's faith in their fighting capacity despite the widening resource gap. Dietrich's personal career advanced correspondingly. Promoted to command the 1st SS Panzer Corps and later the 6th SS Panzer Army, he entered the upper echelon of military decision-making, though his background remained distinct from professional Wehrmacht generals. He was present at Führer conferences and participated in planning for both defensive and counter-offensive operations. By late 1944, he would command during the Ardennes offensive, again blending tactical reputation with moral controversy. But in 1943, the foundations of that dual legacy of battlefield effectiveness and association with war crimes were already visible in the record. The Leibstandarte's Kharkov operation displayed the synchronization of armour, infantry, and artillery under pressure, while leaving behind a trail of scorched settlements and executed prisoners, details that future tribunals would later examine when reassessing the myth of the clean German soldier versus the reality of ideological warfare. The counterstroke at Kharkov in February-March 1943 was conceived as a limited operational restoration, not a decisive reversal. Army Group South under Erich von Manstein sought to exploit Soviet overextension after Stalingrad, destroy forward spearheads, recapture the rail hub of Kharkov, and re-establish a defensible line on the Donets. Paul Hauser's SS Panzer Corps, Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf, was committed as a mobile reserve with the task of striking the flank of the Voronezh front. Within this framework, the 1st SS Panzergrenadier Division Leibstandarte fielded 2 Panzergrenadier regiments, a panzer regiment with roughly 80 to 100 Panzerchaufs, serviceable at the start of operations, divisional artillery of 105mm and 150mm howitzers, an armoured engineer battalion, and self-propelled flak. Actual availability fluctuated daily due to breakdowns, fuel allocation, and battle damage. Corps-wide, around 300 to 350 tanks and assault guns could be committed in waves, rather than as a single mass. Soviet planning combined operational ambition with acute supply strain. Stavka assigned the Voronezh front, Philip Golikov, soon replaced in key sectors by Nikolai Vatutin's formations, to press toward Poltava and the Dnieper after seizing Kharkov on the 16th of February 1943. The 3rd Tank Army under Pavel Rybalko entered the sector with several tank corps equipped predominantly with T-30s foes and T-70s. Initial operational strength around mid-February stood near 400 to 500 tanks, but daily runners varied widely as maintenance and fuel stocks lagged behind advances. Soviet objectives were to cut German withdrawal routes, capture crossings on the Donets, and deny the enemy the use of Kharkov's rail marshalling yards. Artillery densities increased where roads allowed, yet thaw conditions forced columns onto limited paved routes, concentrating targets and delaying ammunition resupply. Both sides' planning hinged on logistics. German doctrine required rapid shifting of mobile reserves by rail to staging areas. The SS Panzer Corps detrained west of the line and moved on road marches with fuel rations calibrated per battalion. A Panzer IV company could burn through several thousand litres in a day's forced movement and combat. Divisional workshops prioritised track repair, final drive replacements, and gun tube changes. The supply base rested on hubs like Poltava and Dnipropetrovsk, with forward dumps established near Krasnograd and Merefa. For the Red Army, the priority was bridging and rail conversion. Engineer battalions worked to restore standard gauge lines, while truck columns carried gasoline in 200-litre drums to core refueling points. The Rasputitsa reduced average march rates to single digits of kilometres per hour for heavy vehicles, reshaping timetables and forcing commanders to accept piecemeal arrivals. At the level of command structure, Dietrich's Leibstandarte operated under Hauser's corps, subordinated to Army Group South's operational concept. Orders of the day emphasised envelopments, panzer grenadiers to fix, panzers to turn flanks, artillery to interdict crossings over the Munzar and Udi. Soviet plans mapped counter-envelopment, Rybalko's tank corps to break into German rear areas, rifle divisions to consolidate and widen corridors, and front artillery to mass for deliberate attacks into Kharkov's urban belt. Staffs on both sides scheduled air support, Luftwaffe close support Gruppen with U-80s and H's 129s, VVS armies with IL-2s, weather permitting. However, each airplan was constrained by fuel and dispersal fields. Operational flying hours per airframe were lower than paper estimates, limiting the tempo of interdiction. Underlying the manoeuvre plans were legal and political directives that shaped behaviour toward prisoners and civilians. The original Commissar order had been formally revised by 1942 in Army channels, but its effects lingered unevenly in the field. Waffen-SS units operated under their own judicial system and received security instructions that categorized political officers and suspected partisans separately from regular POWs. German field orders for Bandenbekämpfung in rear areas permitted destruction of habitations deemed to support irregulars. Soviet planners, anticipating punitive responses, integrated party cadres and NKVD detachments into advancing rifle divisions to restore local administration, secure depots, and document destruction. In practice, this meant that as the SS Panzer Corps sought crossings and road junctions, adjacent villages risked clearance actions. Conversely, Soviet blocking detachments sometimes held urban sectors at all costs, increasing civilian exposure to artillery fire. Propaganda ministries accounted for these operations in advance. German newsreels framed the SS Panzer Corps as a strategic fire brigade restoring the front. Casualty and loss figures were tightly controlled. The Soviet press presented the February advances as liberation, emphasizing tank crews and sappers opening roads through snow and mud. Both sides selected imagery to reinforce morale. German communiques highlighted counterstrokes and the re-entry into Kharkov in mid-March. Soviet bulletins stressed continued pressure and the rebuilding of destroyed infrastructure. These narratives affected expectations at the front. German units anticipated a short, decisive riposte. Soviet formations anticipated immediate resumption of the offensive after regrouping. The conversion of the Leibstandarte from Panzer Grenadier to Panzer Division in the months after Kharkov fed into the next cycle of planning. Tables of organization authorized a Panzer regiment with 2 battalions, Panther and Panzer IV, 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments with 1 battalion on armoured carriers where available, divisional artillery with 3 battalions, and attached Schwer companies with 88mm guns. Recruitment and training pipelines had to replenish losses sustained in February-March. Crew training emphasized gunnery at 1,000 to 1,500 meters against sloped armor, coordinated platoon bounds, and night movement discipline. Staff drills focused on march tables, refuel on the move, and alternate route reconnaissance. Strategic planning for late 1944 placed Dietrich in a different role, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army for the Ardennes offensive. The German High Command set the operational goal to divide US and British forces, cross the Meuse, and seize Antwerp. The main effort in the north fell to Dietrich's army, with II SS Panzer Corps, including 1st SS Panzer and 12th SS Panzer, designated as the spearhead. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army would break through in the centre. Brandenberger's 7th Army would secure the southern flank. Force totals for the offensive approached 200,000 personnel, with roughly 1,400 armoured fighting vehicles across all armies at the outset. 6th SS Panzer Army's leading Kampfgruppen, most prominently Kampfgruppe Piper from the Leibstandarte, assembled around 4,500 to 5,000 men, with approximately 100 to 120 tanks and assault guns, including Panthers and Tiger IIs, plus over 100 half-tracks. Fuel planning dominated. The opening phase required capturing US depots to sustain movement beyond the Meuse. Terrain studies identified road nets through the Eifel and Ardennes, capable of supporting parallel regimental columns. But single-lane forest roads created choke points where one disabled vehicle could halt entire battalions. Soviet and Western Allied intelligence assessments shaped opposing plans. In the east, Stavka, in late 1944, concentrated for the Vistula-Oder operation, assuming the Wehrmacht could not mass for major Western offensives. In the west, Allied command estimated German capacity for local counterattacks, not a theatre-level operation. German planners counted on surprise and poor flying weather to neutralize Allied air power for 48 to 72 hours. Dietrich's staff produced march graphics, engineer tasks for bridge seizure, and deception operations, including Otto Skorzini's English-speaking formations in US uniforms. Rules of engagement briefings emphasize speed and shock. There is no surviving German operations order instructing the killing of prisoners, yet combination of compressed timetables, dispersed spearheads, and unit cultures hardened by the Eastern Front created conditions in which violations occurred once combat began. Across both theatres, miscalculation lay in the gap between authorised tables and actual daily availability. In Ukraine, in 1943, and in the Ardennes, in 1944, planners assumed tempo that logistics could not always maintain. Ammunition columns arrived late, bridging units lacked enough assault boats, and fuel consumption outpaced forecasts when road conditions deteriorated. Strategic goals, retake a rail hub, capture a deep-water port, were clear. The execution depended on granular factors: the number of serviceable Panthers at dawn, the endurance of replacement crews, the state of a single crossroads village. It was within these constraints that Dietrich's formation prepared to fight, and within these constraints that subsequent investigations would later compare combat diaries with evidence of how orders were implemented on the ground. The opening engagements that defined Sepp Dietrich's formation unfolded in two distinct theatres, separated by 21 months. The Kharkov counteroffensive of February-March 1943 and the first days of the Ardennes offensive beginning 16th of December 1944. In both cases, the first SS Panzers spearheads were introduced after infantry, and standard panzer divisions had absorbed the initial shock. At Kharkov, the SS Panzer Corps entered a fluid battlefield where Soviet armoured columns had outrun rifle support. In the Ardennes, the 6th SS Panzer Army attacked a prepared American defensive belt in forest and ridge country under winter weather that grounded most aircraft. The contrast in terrain and opponent altered tactics, but the division's task at the outset remained constant: breakthrough, regain momentum, and 16 road junctions essential for further exploitation. On the Eastern Front, the first clashes followed Haus's order to wheel south and west of Kharkov and strike the flanks of the Voronezh front. Between 20th and 25th February 1943, Leibstandarte's advance guard, Panzer Grenadiers on trucks and half-tracks, with a company of Panzer IVs, pushed through villages on the Krasnograd-Marefa axis. Opposition came from elements of the 3rd Tank Army and attached rifle divisions attempting to hold river crossings on the Mzya and Udi. German daily reports registered small encirclements, company-sized strongpoints isolated, 100 to 300 prisoners taken at a time, and 8 to 15 tanks disabled per day by combined anti-tank guns and close-range engagements. Soviet summaries from the same period, compiled at Army headquarters, recorded the need to rotate tank brigades after 48 to 72 hours due to losses and fuel exhaustion, while engineer units prioritized bridge repair under artillery fire. Territorial control shifted kilometre by kilometre, with crossroads villages changing hands once or twice in a single day, as both sides funneled reserves down the few paved routes passable in thaw. Urban fighting on Kharkov's outskirts started in the second week of March. House-to-house engagements were preceded by artillery preparation using 105mm and 150mm howitzers, firing in direct and high-angle modes to reduce strong points. Soviet garrisons, combinations of rifle battalions, sappers, and anti-tank detachments with 45mm and 76mm guns, organized defense by blocks, covering streets with mines and interlocking fields of fire. German assault groups paired engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges to breach walls and cellars. Casualty accounting from both sides suggests the density of combat. The SS Panzer Corps reported daily losses in the hundreds across its divisions. Soviet army figures indicated several thousand casualties over the week of street fighting, with tank write-offs rising as vehicles were trapped in rubble-choked avenues. Civilians within the city had limited evacuation windows. Municipal records and post-war testimonies point to food shortages, shellfire damage to water mains, and ad hoc field hospitals set up in schools and churches. Behind these tactical engagements, rear area interactions began almost immediately. German field police and SS security elements screened groups of prisoners at temporary collection points. Where Red Army units left political officers or party functionaries in garrisons, German reports noted summary handling under security directives. Villages on approach routes were searched for weapons and radios. Claims of partisans or snipers led to building clearances and, in some cases, burnings, documented later by Soviet commissions. German justifications cited protection of supply columns and prevention of ambush. Soviet and civilian statements emphasized the absence of organized resistance and the killing of non-combatants. These parallel records formed the earliest layer of evidence that later investigators would set alongside combat diaries for the same dates and coordinates. In the Ardennes, the first engagement sequence opened before dawn on December 16, 1944, with an artillery barrage along a front of approximately 130 kilometers. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army controlled the northern sector, with ISS Panzer Corps directed toward Elsenborn Ridge and the road net leading to Malmedy and Stavelot. American forces opposing them, primarily the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions with attached tank destroyer battalions, held fortified villages and ridgelines supported by pre-sighted artillery. The initial German infantry assaults in the Losheim Gap met wire, mines and localized counterattacks. Progress measured hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. Weather limitations reduced Allied air intervention on day one, yet choke points emerged where blown bridges and disabled vehicles stalled columns. And on 17th December, Kampfgruppe Piper, constituted from Leibstandarte elements, including a Panther battalion, a Panzer IV battalion, assault guns, armoured infantry, engineers, and flak, broke through the American line near the Losheimer Graben and turned west. Early gains hinged on road captures. Honsfeld and Büllingen provided fuel and passage, while American rear echelons withdrew along converging routes. Pieper's leading companies advanced in packets to keep momentum, bypassing resistance and leaving follow-on units to clear. The day's movements also produced multiple prisoner encounters. At the Baugnier crossroads near Malmedy in early afternoon, a column of American prisoners was assembled under guard. Soon after, gunfire killed captives in an open field. Post-war investigations identified 84 dead at that site, with additional killings recorded in the same 24 to 48-hour window at locations on the group's route. German unit logs for the day focused on bridge seizure and fuel status. American after-action reports documented the loss of personnel, the forced reorientation of roadblocks, and the consolidation of a new line towards Stavelot and Stoumont. Operationally, the American stand on Elsenborn Ridge shaped all subsequent movement. The ridge's elevation and prepared artillery zones enabled defenders to halt repeated attacks by the 12th SS Panzer Division and associated units, limiting the lateral space available to ISS Panzer Corps. As a result, Piper's column funneled along fewer roads, magnifying the effect of every destroyed bridge or abandoned truck. Fuel planning assumptions, capture of depots within 24 hours, proved optimistic. By the evening of December 18th, reports inside 6th SS Panzer Army acknowledged shortfalls that forced temporary halts and searches for alternate crossings at Stavelot and Trois Ponts. American engineers responded by blowing bridges ahead of the spearhead, trading ground for time and keeping the Meuse approaches out of German reach. The initial casualties in the sector reflected the imbalance between German ambition and infrastructure. German armoured losses in the first 3 days included vehicles destroyed by direct fire at roadblocks, mines on forest lanes, and abandonment due to empty fuel tanks when bridges could not be repaired in time. American records counted several thousand casualties in the army group over the opening week, with unit-level losses concentrated in battalions caught on roads by sudden armoured thrusts. Civilian exposure differed from Kharkov. Evacuations occurred along short distances to nearby towns, and destructions centered on bridges and buildings in the path of columns. However, killings associated with prisoner incidents and the exchange of fire in inhabited villages entered local memory and legal proceedings as discrete events with specific coordinates and times. In both theatres, unexpected outcomes appeared quickly. At Kharkov, the speed of the German counterstroke surprised Soviet staffs expecting a prolonged pause after Stalingrad, leading to hasty orders to pull armoured units back behind rivers that had not yet been bridged. In the Ardennes, German planners correctly predicted a temporary lull in Allied air power, but underestimated how American artillery, map grids and engineer demolitions could substitute for aircraft in delaying armour. For Dietrich's formations, the first days validated and constrained doctrines simultaneously. Combined arms thrusts produced penetrations, but terrain, logistics, and the enemy's adaptive use of roads and ridges turned those penetrations into narrow corridors vulnerable to interdiction. From the outset, the record thus combined columns of tanks, refuel points, and bridge numbers with interrogation notes, village-level searches and prisoner lists, materials that would later be read together, rather than separately when assessing how combat operations and violations of the laws of war intersected in real time. As the engagements around Kharkov and in the Ardennes intensified, both campaigns entered a phase of escalation that revealed the limits of command control and the increasing entanglement between military necessity and political expectation. By mid-March 1943, the Leibstandarte and its sister SS divisions had secured Kharkov, but the cost in manpower, materiel, and civilian destruction far exceeded initial projections. In December 1944, Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army faced a similar paradox. Early tactical penetrations failed to achieve operational depth, while the conduct of subordinate units under pressure brought renewed scrutiny to questions of discipline and legality. In both warscapes, escalation emerged from friction between plan and reality, the moment when supply, weather, and human endurance transformed a theoretical offensive into an improvised struggle. In Ukraine, the consolidation of Kharkov's recapture demanded urban clearance and perimeter defense. The SS Panzer Corps, now holding the shattered city, faced Soviet counterattacks on its northern and eastern flanks. Daily reports from the Leibstandarte listed street-by-street mop-up operations and artillery bombardments directed at assembly areas beyond the city limits. Soviet front headquarters attempted to stabilize the situation by committing reserve rifle corps and increasing artillery densities along the Donets. In this period, Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS records show rising non-combat casualties from exhaustion, frostbite, and typhus, while ammunition expenditure in urban sectors exceeded peacetime monthly production for some calibers. Reinforcements from Western Germany arrived too late to restore full strength before the next Soviet offensive in the summer. Logistically, Kharkov represented both success and strain. German engineers repaired bridges and rail lines under air attack to re-establish supply to forward depots, while Soviet night bombers targeted junctions and fuel trains. Command friction grew between SS and Wehrmacht headquarters. Army Group South favoured pulling back to shorter lines, whereas Himmler and Hauser pressed for holding the recaptured city for propaganda value. Within the Leibstandarte, company commanders had to reconcile contradictory directives: prepare for renewed attacks, conduct security sweeps in the outskirts, and manage the treatment of captured personnel. Reports of shootings of commissars and saboteurs continued, documented inconsistently, and later forming part of Soviet evidentiary files. For German officers, these were recorded as routine field measures. For Soviet investigators, they were classed as executions outside combat. Meanwhile, the Soviet civilian population within the Kharkov region endured extensive displacement. German military administrations organized forced labor details to repair roads and dig anti-tank ditches. Food requisitions deepened shortages. Evacuation orders from the Soviet side had removed large numbers of able-bodied residents earlier, leaving mainly the elderly, women and children. Partisan activities in the countryside provoked further retaliations. Anti-partisan directives issued by Army Group South in March 1943 authorized the destruction of dwellings within a set radius of any attack. SS security battalions implemented these rules rigidly, generating a pattern of devastation that persisted long after front lines moved east. Thus, escalation at Kharkov was not confined to the battlefield. It extended into the civilian domain through cycles of reprisal and control. In the Ardennes, escalation followed a different trajectory. By 19th December 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance had overreached its supply capacity. Fuel captured from American depots was insufficient to sustain movement, and bridges ahead were systematically demolished. Attempts to seize crossings at Stavelot and Trois Ponts failed under combined artillery and engineer resistance. American forces re-established control over the Meuse approaches, while improving weather on the 23rd to 24th of December allowed Allied aircraft to resume full-scale attacks. The Luftwaffe's inability to provide sustained air cover left German columns exposed. Photographic reconnaissance and fighter-bomber strikes destroyed convoys along forest roads, immobilizing armor and transport. For the Leibstandarte, losses became irreplaceable. By December 24th, many Panther and Tiger II tanks were either destroyed or abandoned, and infantry companies were reduced to fractions of their nominal strength. During these same days, reports from American headquarters detailed the discovery of executed prisoners and civilians along the route of Peiper's advance. Field investigators documented sites at Bagnères, Ligneville, Stavelot, and other localities, collecting testimonies from survivors. The combination of ballistic evidence, medical examination, and consistent eyewitness accounts established a timeline of killings coinciding with the unit's progress. German radio intercepts and later interrogation of captured personnel confirmed that confusion, anger at resistance, and the pressure of encirclement had eroded command discipline. Dietrich's army headquarters, operating kilometers behind the front, received fragmentary reports but issued no documented reprimand until the formation was already in retreat. When Peiper's Kampfgruppe was surrounded near La Glaise and fought its way out on the 23rd of December, the division's cohesion had already fractured under combined external and internal strain. Political demands from Berlin exacerbated this deterioration. Hitler's personal order to hold ground at all costs reached Dietrich on the 24th of December, by which time the situation rendered such defence untenable. The 6th SS Panzer Army attempted partial withdrawals through forested terrain, leaving wrecked vehicles to block pursuit. Civilian casualties mounted as villages became temporary strongpoints or artillery targets. By the time the offensive ended in early January 1945, German losses numbered over 80,000 killed, wounded, or captured across all armies involved. The Leibstandarte alone reported around 40% personnel reduction. The episode would later form a central exhibit at the Malmedy trial, but in real time, it appeared as the culmination of an operation that had outpaced its material base. For the soldiers of both sides, the escalation phase translated into daily endurance and uncertainty. German diaries describe forced marches through snow, rationing of single litres of fuel per vehicle, and orders to destroy equipment to prevent capture. American infantrymen wrote of constant artillery fire and clearing frozen bodies from the roads. Civilians fled into cellars or forests, marking doors with white cloths to signal non-combatant status. On neither front did escalation produce decisive advantage. Instead, it revealed the exhaustion of both men and systems. In Ukraine, the Leibstandarte's battlefield success produced only a temporary stabilization before the Soviet summer offensives drove the front west again. In the Ardennes, tactical advances achieved no strategic breakthrough, and ended in attrition that depleted Germany's last reserves of armour and fuel. Throughout these campaigns, Dietrich's command authority remained formally intact, but practically limited. In 1943, he commanded at division and corps level. By late 1944, at army level. The expansion of scale diluted personal oversight. His reliance on trusted subordinates, many drawn from the same SS networks, ensured ideological loyalty, but also created insularity from broader military norms. In the field, junior officers applied operational orders alongside unwritten assumptions inherited from the Eastern Front. Treatment of irregulars, reprisals for resistance, and summary justice. The Wehrmacht's own command struggled with these same boundaries. Its legal apparatus, though codified, often deferred to operational convenience. When conditions deteriorated and communication lines fractured, directives from higher levels lost specificity, allowing local initiative to decide outcomes that would later be judged criminal. By early 1945, the cumulative effect of these crises shaped perceptions within Germany itself. Propaganda continued to emphasize heroism and endurance, but the Wehrmacht's correspondence and diaries show a growing sense that ideological warfare had consumed traditional soldierly codes. Among Allied observers, reports from liberated areas in Belgium and the Soviet Union provided concrete evidence that the distinction between elite combat and atrocity had collapsed in practice. Escalation, therefore, was not merely a military phase. It was the point at which the two images of Dietrich's SS Panzers, disciplined armoured elite and agents of violence beyond control, became inseparable in the historical record. At Kharkov in March 1943, the peak arrived when the SS Panzer Corps concentrated armour, engineers and artillery for a deliberate re-entry into the city. The Leibstandarte committed its panzer regiment in battalion groups while panzer grenadiers cleared blocks abreast, each assault group integrating flamethrowers, demolition charges and direct fire guns. Divisional artillery fired timed concentrations to cut streets into segments, and anti-aircraft batteries in ground roll provided additional high-velocity fire against strong points. Manstein's headquarters authorized the effort as a capped operational aim: retake the rail hub, then stabilize on the Donets. Hauser's corps translated this into sequential objectives: southern suburbs, central squares, then bridges. By 14th to 15th March, the SS divisions had secured the core districts. German diaries recorded the commitment of reserve companies to sustain momentum when defenders counterattacked along tram lines and factory rows. Soviet reports noted the withdrawal of depleted battalions to second lines after ammunition ran short. The result produced measurable, but limited, territorial gain. The city centre and key junctions returned to German control, while outer belts remained contested and subject to nightly artillery harassment. Losses at the peak reflected the intensity of urban assault. The SS Panzer Corps' daily readiness lists show tank availability dipping as vehicles were immobilized by rubble or damaged by close-range anti-tank fire. Assault guns, with lower silhouettes and better traverse in streets, often replaced tanks in lead rolls. Soviet armour, constrained by debris and minefields, fought as turreted pillboxes at intersections, backed by sapper teams. Casualty flows surged on both sides. German medical companies converted school buildings into clearing stations, while Soviet field hospitals relocated repeatedly under shelling. Civilians in central Kharkov, limited by curfews and blocked routes, relied on water hauled from ruptured mains and on ration bread distributed at guarded points. Municipal registries recorded spikes in deaths from exposure and untreated wounds. Evacuations proceeded in small groups rather than organised columns, with many residents sheltering in basements until fire or collapse forced movement. The high command decisions that enabled this peak also set its limits. Manstein's backhand blow doctrine required mobile reserves to strike overstretched attackers, not to hold extended salients. After the city's capture, the SS Panzer Corps was instructed to shorten its lines, yet political messaging in Berlin amplified the retaking of Kharkov as a strategic victory, and requests to retain a larger perimeter persisted. Dietrich's division therefore split effort between consolidating inner districts and preparing anti-tank positions east of the city. Engineers erected hasty obstacles on avenues leading to the Donetsk crossings. Artillery registered counter-battery lines. The peak of fighting, in short, delivered a tactical reversal but exposed the fragility of German holding power given fuel, ammunition, and manpower constraints that could not be remedied before the next Soviet regrouping. The Ardennes reached its height between the 17th and 24th of December 1944, when the 6th SS Panzer Army's northern thrust was closest to breaking through to the Meuse. Dietrich's command plan required SS Panzer Corps to pass through infantry breaches rapidly, seize crossings, and open multiple parallel routes for heavy armour. In practice, contested villages became successive choke points, while Elsenborn Ridge anchored American artillery fires. Kampfgruppe Piper represented the designed cutting edge, a composite of Panthers, Panzerviehs, assault guns, armoured infantry, engineers, flak, and logistics elements packaged for speed. Once through the initial line, it moved in column fragments to outpace American reaction, capturing fuel and prisoners at Honsfeld and Bullingen, and turning toward Stavelot and Trois-Ponts. The peak phase was characterized by a race across limited road nets. Every intact bridge allowed a battalion to cross. Every demolition forced detours that cost hours and fuel. At this apex, operational gains and emerging losses overlapped. Piper's forward companies reached Stoumont and La Glaise. Map distances to the Meuse narrowed, yet the corridor behind them thinned. American engineers dropped spans at Trois-Ponts and Stavelot. Artillery concentrations, registered onto road approaches, punished any attempt to mass. The weather window began to close. By 23rd to 24th December, Allied air power reasserted itself, disrupting columns in rear areas and strafing supply convoys moving up from the Eifel. Fuel planning, predicated on seizing depots, fell short as resistance stiffened. Reports within 6th SS Panzer Army during the peak acknowledged tanks stranded for lack of petrol and the need to abandon serviceable vehicles to maintain infantry mobility. At the same time, the incidents along the route, killings of prisoners at Bonnier/Malmedy and other sites, fixed legal and moral consequences onto the military narrative. American Corps headquarters, integrating eyewitness accounts with unit timelines, shifted reserves not only to halt armour, but also to secure rear areas and document crimes. Command choices, at the height of the offensive, reveal competing imperatives. Hitler's directive emphasized a breakthrough to Antwerp, prohibiting lateral shifts that might have reinforced Manteuffel's more successful centre. Dietrich's staff pushed for continued pressure along assigned axes, despite growing evidence that Elsenborn Ridge could not be pried open at acceptable cost. Orders to hold captured villages transformed them into traps under observed artillery fire. When Piper's spearhead reached La Glaise with dwindling fuel, the decision matrix narrowed to withdrawal on foot or encirclement. The subsequent breakout on 23rd December preserved personnel at the price of abandoning heavy equipment. Thus, the peak crystallized as both the closest approach to operational success and the moment's strategic intent exceeded means. Civilian conditions in the Ardennes during this period reflected compressed combat zones. Populations in Stavelot, Stoumont, and surrounding hamlets moved between cellars and ad hoc aid stations. Some fled westward as columns clashed at village edges. Destruction clustered around bridges, rail crossings, and structures used as strongpoints. American civil affairs detachments and Belgian authorities organized local evacuations when firing pauses permitted, documenting damage for post-war claims. The legal record for December 1944, assembled while operations still ran, captured names, times, and unit identifiers with a precision seldom possible on the Eastern Front, where front lines and communications often precluded immediate investigation. Across both theatres, the peak exposed how tactical proficiency could not compensate for systemic limits. In Kharkov, combined arms synchronization delivered the city but could not create a sustainable defensive arc against a larger, replenished opponent. In the Ardennes, shock action achieved penetrations but could not overcome terrain, artillery, engineer demolitions, and resurgent air power. For Dietrich's formations, the height of combat effectiveness coincided with maximum exposure to scrutiny. Divisional logs, corps orders, prisoner lists, and civilian testimonies all date from these days. Later tribunals would revisit this concentrated record to pass intent, control, and responsibility. At the peak, however, commanders and soldiers confronted immediate variables: fuel in a tank, a bridge intact or fallen, a block cleared or defended, and acted within doctrines and directives that linked their battlefield choices to outcomes far beyond the tactical map. Resilience after the peak of combat required each side to alter methods, redistribute scarce material, and absorb psychological shocks. Following the March 1943 recapture of Kharkov, the Leibstandarte reconfigured its battalions for defense in depth west of the Donets. Company frontages were reduced, strongpoints were tied to anti-tank guns in hull-down positions, and mobile reserves were organized as Kampfgruppen that mixed a platoon of Panzer IVs, a Panzer Grenadier Company, engineers, and a battery of 105mm howitzers for immediate counterattacks. Ammunition control became routine. Infantry companies received daily allocations by grenade and belt. Artillery switched to timed concentrations rather than prolonged barrages, and tank crews were instructed to engage at 800 to 1,200 meters to conserve armor-piercing rounds. Workshops cannibalized knocked-out vehicles to keep a smaller core of runners. The division trained for night movement on blackout roads and rehearsed radio brevity codes to keep nets clear under Soviet jamming. Soviet adaptation in the same sector combined methodical regrouping with augmentation of anti-tank depth. Rifle divisions reconstructed assault groups with sappers and submachine gun platoons for factory belts and railway yards, while artillery headquarters concentrated 76mm and 122mm guns along likely avenues. Tank brigades revised approaches in urban sectors, advancing by short bounds under smoke with infantry on foot. Logistics teams improved forward dumps and standardized the use of sledges and narrow-gauge rails during mud seasons. Political departments replaced decimated party cadres and re-established municipal committees to repair utilities. Partisan detachments intensified rail interdiction on lines feeding Kharkov, reporting demolitions of bridges measured in tens per month across the wider region, which forced German traffic into predictable detours where ambushes could be set. This interplay, regular forces pressing the front and irregulars constraining supply, limited the ability of the Leibstandarte to rotate units for rest. German countermeasures to partisans followed security directives that paired field police with SS and police battalions. Villages near cut rails were searched, male residents screened, and buildings suspected of sheltering irregulars destroyed according to radius rules around ambush sites. Rear Area Command tasked the Leibstandarte with route security on specific days, diverting line companies from the front. These operations produced short-term reductions in attacks, but imposed a manpower burden and heightened civilian displacement. Soviet staff noted that even temporary German sweeps created windows for regrouping, since divisions committed to security could not reinforce threatened sectors at the same tempo. Institutional learning continued inside the Leibstandarte as it converted fully to a panzer division. Training films and live ranges emphasized tank infantry communications using flags, flares, and SCR-5-36 equivalents captured earlier, while mechanics drilled rapid track changes under field conditions. The Panzer Regiment integrated new Panthers, where available, and retained Panzer IVs to stabilize maintenance. engineers stockpiled prefabricated obstacles and practiced demolition of their own bridges to trade space for time should withdrawal be ordered. At staff level, march tables were rewritten to include alternate routes and fixed times for refuel halts every 80 to 120 kilometers, reflecting experience with road wear and axle failures. Medical officers introduced standard drills for trench foot prevention and frostbite treatment after the winter of 1942 to 1943 produced hundreds of non-combat losses. In the Ardennes, after 24 December 1944, American adaptation hinged on artillery, engineers, and air power. Divisional artillery, normally 72 105mm howitzers and 12 155mm howitzers per infantry division, massed fires through corps-level control, producing densities that covered road approaches to Elsenborn Ridge with pre-planned defensive barrages. Engineer battalions executed layered demolitions, dropping bridges in sequence to force German armour into defiles, then mining withdrawal routes to punish attempts at bypass. With weather clearing, fighter bombers attacked road columns and fuel depots, while reconnaissance aircraft reported traffic jams whose lengths were measured in kilometres. Infantry regiments reorganised roadblocks around bazooka teams and tank destroyer gun lines, using map grids to call in artillery within minutes. American logistics rerouted gasoline from threatened depots and implemented priority convoys for artillery ammunition, raising expenditure rates without collapse. German forces under Dietrich adapted by compressing spearheads, abandoning vehicles when fuel could not be obtained, and attempting night thrusts to reduce exposure to air attack. Kampfgruppe Piper reallocated fuel by siphoning from immobilized trucks, keeping a handful of Panthers and half-tracks moving, while sending foot patrols to scout crossings. Other elements of the Leibstandarte formed smaller Kampfgruppen to hold villages with combined machine gun, mortar, and assault gun positions. Flak units shifted to close defense against aircraft and to ground roll at choke points. Orders from Army headquarters authorized flexible withdrawals to ridge lines when bridgeheads could not be expanded. Despite these measures, the cumulative effect of destroyed bridges, air interdiction, and accurate artillery made prolonged defensive action untenable. Legal and disciplinary adaptation took divergent paths. American commands issued explicit instructions to collect affidavits, preserve scenes of killings, and forward lists of missing to provost courts. Investigative detachments entered Malmedy and nearby sites within hours or days, creating a chain of custody for evidence. German headquarters, facing encirclements and fuel starvation, focused on battlefield survival. No operational order-altering prisoner handling is recorded from Dietrich's staff during the offensive. After the retreat, internal debriefings concentrated on traffic control, engineer shortfalls and fuel planning errors rather than on conduct investigations. This asymmetry in documentation would later shape trial records. Resource management became critical on both fronts. In Ukraine, daily tank readiness in the Leibstandarte fluctuated below authorized tables, with serviceable vehicles sometimes fewer than 60 in a regiment designed for over 100. Artillery ammunition types were redistributed nightly to keep counter-battery capability. Fuel allocations were calculated in tens of thousands of litres per week and often fell short when Soviet attacks forced redeployment. In Belgium, German columns measured gasoline in 200-litre drums, scrounged from depots and civilian stocks. US depots instituted guarded dispersal to prevent single strikes from destroying entire stocks. Medical services in both theatres struggled with cold injuries. Cold-related casualties across the Ardennes campaign reached into the thousands for each side, adding to the burden of evacuation under fire. Psychological adaptation is traceable in contemporary writing. German letters describe relief at short local successes followed by resignation when fuel ran out or orders changed. American diaries in December 1944 note initial confusion, then confidence as artillery and air returned. Soviet records around Kharkov record pride in stubborn defense and frustration at supply delays. Civilians adjusted by establishing ad hoc shelters, distributing food through church or municipal networks, and marking buildings for medical use. The experience was not uniform. Some towns saw rapid occupation and withdrawal within 48 hours. Others endured intermittent shelling for weeks. Innovation accompanied this adaptation. The Leibstandarte adopted more frequent use of assault guns in lead roles in urban sectors, pairing them with engineers and snipers to clear floors above street level. American forces employed proximity-fused artillery shells by late December, improving effectiveness against infantry moving along forest edges and roads. Soviet staffs experimented with artillery rolling barrages even in city grids, coordinating with sappers to clear lanes. Radio discipline improved across all sides, with shorter, code-based transmissions, replacing long reports that jammed nets at critical moments. By early 1945, these adjustments had hardened into routine. For Dietrich's formations, resistance from opponents and the material environment forced a shift from rapid exploitation to conserving combat power through selective engagements, planned withdrawals, and small unit counterattacks. For their adversaries, systematic use of artillery, engineers, and air, combined with administrative and legal measures, turned initial shocks into managed crises. This phase did not decide campaigns by itself. It defined how each side endured to the next turning point, leaving a paper trail of orders, logs, requisitions, and testimonies that would later be examined to understand not only how battles were fought, but how armies and populations adapted under pressure. Turning points in Dietrich's record emerged when military plans met limits that altered the direction of entire campaigns. In the East, the shift came in July-August 1943, when Operation Citadel failed to achieve a breakout and the Soviet counteroffensives reversed the gains made at Kharkov. In the West, the decisive change occurred between 23rd and 26th December 1944, when weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and American artillery and engineers fixed German spearheads short of the Meuse. In both theatres, the inflection did not arise from a single engagement alone, but from the accumulation of constraints, fuel, bridges, and attrition that transformed tactical thrusts into retreats and triggered parallel legal scrutiny of conduct along the way. On the southern face of the Kursk salient, 2nd SS Panzer Corps, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf opened Citadel on July 5, 1943, with approximately 300 to 350 tanks and assault guns fit for combat. The Red Army deployed layered defences with thousands of mines, anti-tank strongpoints, and reserve tank armies. When the 5th Guards Tank Army counter-attacked near Prokhorovka on July 12th, the result was a collision of armoured forces at short range. Daily readiness fell on both sides. German units reported dozens of vehicles disabled by mines and mechanical failures as much as by gunfire, while Soviet brigade logs recorded rapid replacements pushed forward to keep battalions near establishment. On 13th July, the German High Command halted Citadel as Soviet operations north and south of the salient, Operation Kutuzov and the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive, opened. What had been framed as the exploitation phase after Kharkov turned into a defensive fight. For the Leibstandarte, the turning point had immediate operational consequences. Between 3 and 23 August 1943, Soviet fronts drove toward Belgorod and Kharkov with reinforced rifle and tank armies. German records show the division's Panzer regiment often fielding fewer than 60 runners against Soviet formations that could commit several hundred tanks in a sector. Engineers blew bridges on the Donets to buy time. Artillery expended stocks at rates that forced rationing. Urban positions inside Kharkov that the SS Panzer Corps had retaken in March were evacuated stepwise as flanking pressure mounted. On 23 August, Soviet forces re-entered the city. The loss of Kharkov marked the end of sustained German offensive initiative in the south. In personnel terms, SS divisions reported cumulative losses that could not be replaced at the former tempo. In material terms, workshops lacked spares for Panthers just arriving and relied on Panzer IVs to keep a mobile screen. Strategically, Dietrich's formation was redeployed afterward to other theatres as a fire brigade rather than as a mass defensive instrument, reflecting the shift from recovery to containment. This eastern turning point also intersected with the record of conduct. As German units retrograded, rear area authority grew diffuse. Anti-partisan sweeps intensified to secure withdrawals. Soviet reports listed burned settlements along retreat routes in Kharkiv and Poltava regions. Prisoner handling became inconsistent when collection points moved daily and transport capacity contracted. Where earlier months produced mixed documentation, August 1943 generated clearer Soviet files that paired battlefield maps with village-level testimonies, fixing dates and unit identifiers to events that had previously been described only in general terms. The simultaneous military setback and improved evidentiary record would later matter when comparing operational logs against allegations of crimes. In the Ardennes, the hinge occurred once the offensive's initial surprise dissipated. On 23 December 1944, skies cleared, and Allied fighter bombers began continuous strikes against road columns and supply points. American engineers had already destroyed bridges at Stavelot and Trois Ponts. Artillery densities on Elsenborn Ridge made massing armour prohibitively costly. Kampfgruppe Piper, which had advanced with roughly 100 to 120 tanks and assault guns at the outset, reported dwindling fuel and reduced combat strength. By 24th to 25th December, forward companies in Stoumont and La Glaise faced encirclement as American units re-established lateral connections. On 26 December, the relief of Bastogne by elements of Third Army stabilized the southern shoulder and freed reserves for counterattacks that threatened German lines of communication. Quantitative measures capture the shift. Across the offensive, German forces began with around 1,400 armoured fighting vehicles. Within the first 10 days, hundreds were destroyed or abandoned due to fire, mines, air attack, or fuel exhaustion. In Dietrich's sector, attempts to reopen routes to the Meuse failed as each intact bridge west of the Amblève and Salm turned into a defended strongpoint covered by registered artillery. American formations, fielding divisional artillery packages of over 80 guns per division and supported by corps-level guns, could mass fire on grid coordinates in minutes. Air interdiction multiplied the effect. Transports and fuel tankers destroyed along the Eifel roads forced redistribution at the front by siphoning. By 27th to 28th December, orders within 6th SS Panzer Army acknowledged that the main effort could no longer reach the Meuse and directed holding actions to cover withdrawals. The legal dimension sharpened at the same time. While combat continued, American investigative teams documented shootings of prisoners at Baugnier, Ligneville, and nearby sites, interviewing survivors and securing medical and ballistic reports. The correlation between the route of Piper's column and reported incidents created a contemporaneous evidentiary chain. German command traffic from the period, oriented toward movement and survival, reflected no explicit shift in rules of engagement, leaving post-war assessments to infer responsibility from unit presence, timelines, and testimony. Thus, the military turning point, loss of momentum and onset of retreat, coincided with the formation of a prosecutorial record which would shape proceedings after the war. For troops and civilians, the inflection was visible in immediate changes. In Ukraine in August 1943, German units pulled back at night, demolishing depots and bridges. Soviet civilians observed smoke columns and roadblocks moving west day by day. In Belgium in late December 1944, German spearheads switched from thrust to breakout, leaving damaged vehicles as obstacles. Local populations saw American security cordons, search teams, and casualty recovery begin even as shelling continued. The same shift affected Dietrich's staff role, from directing forward movement to organizing extrication under pressure, reallocating scarce fuel to retrieve personnel, and coordinating rearguards to delay encirclement. Turning points therefore linked operational decision and legal consequence. When Citadel ended and Kharkov fell again, the SS Panzer Corps' role changed from attacker to rearguard, and the record of destroyed villages and POW shootings in the east acquired clearer attribution as lines compressed. When the Ardennes stalled and withdrawals began, prisoner murders documented along Piper's Path moved from battlefield rumours to cases with coordinates, dates, and unit identifications. In both arenas, the tactical map determined what could be proved as much as what could be achieved, setting conditions for the aftermath that followed: retreat, judicial inquiries, and the reassessment of claims about soldierly honour alongside the conduct recorded in the files. Retreat and consolidation followed quickly once the limits of both campaigns became apparent. In the east, August 1943 opened with sustained Soviet pressure along the Belgorod-Kharkov axis. After re-entering the city on August 23rd, the Red Army pushed German forces toward the Poltava Line and the Dnieper. The Leibstandarte, already below establishment in tanks and infantry, executed phased withdrawals at night, destroying depots and bridges and laying mines on likely pursuit routes. Rearguards consisted of assault gun batteries and panzer grenadier companies covering road junctions for hours rather than days. Supply columns moved under strict light discipline, and wounded were evacuated on mixed trains that carried both ammunition inbound and casualties outbound. Engineer reports recorded demolition of multiple Donets and Vorskla crossings in a 72-hour period to extend the time-distance factor before Soviet armour could reach the next line. Civilian conditions in Kharkiv Oblast during this withdrawal combined abrupt regime change with shortages. Soviet evacuation earlier in the year had removed industrial equipment and a portion of the workforce. The German occupation had requisitioned food and labour. The second Soviet return reinstated rationing and mobilised labour for bridge repair and rail conversion. NKVD and party commissions opened files on collaboration and alleged atrocities, interviewing residents and documenting burned settlements on retreat routes. Some local officials were arrested for cooperation with German authorities. Others resumed posts under new directives. The immediate humanitarian burden included housing for returnees, restoration of water and electricity, and burial details for those killed in shelling or reprisals. The record thus contains parallel lists, military march tables and demolition logs on one side. On the other, municipal inventories and investigative protocols. Organisationally, the Leibstandarte left the sector after the Dnieper line stabilised. In September-October 1943, it redeployed to Italy for disarmament of former Italian units and security duties after the armistice, then shifted to France for refitting in early 1944. This interval saw a change in personnel composition as replacement drafts filled companies, while veterans moved into cadre roles. Training shifted toward anti-armour defence against Western Allied equipment, introducing recognition and gunnery drills for Shermans and Churchills, alongside renewed emphasis on night movement and immediate action drills in Bocage-like terrain. The division's Panzer regiment rebuilt around Panzer IVs and later Panthers as deliveries permitted. However, workshops reported continuing shortages of transmissions and final drives, leading to acceptance of fewer runners than tables prescribed. In the West, the immediate aftermath of the Ardennes offensive unfolded between late December 1944 and January 1945. After the failure to secure Meuse crossings and the loss of forward armour to fuel starvation and air attack, Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army pulled back toward the West Wall. Kampfgruppe Piper broke out from La Glaise on the 23rd of December with small groups on foot. Many heavy vehicles were left behind and later examined by Allied technical teams. American forces retook villages along the Amblev and Salm, logging destroyed bridges and recovering bodies at massacre sites identified by survivors. As weather continued to favor Allied air operations, German movements shifted almost entirely to night, with columns hidden in forests by day and dispersal ordered at every halt. Divisional returns listed rifle companies at fractions of strength and battalion staffs consolidated to maintain communications. January 1945 saw the Leibstandarte reconstituting pieces of its structure in Germany and Austria before redeployment east for Operation Spring Awakening in Hungary. The broader aim assigned to the 6th SS Panzer Army was to stabilize the Nagy-Kanisa oil region and push to relieve Budapest. The division received some Panthers and Tiger IIs, but entered operations with fuel allocations, measured per vehicle per day, and contingency plans for siphoning from disabled transport. Engineer bridging equipment was insufficient for the marshy approaches, and the thaw increased road failures. Reports from the first week of March recorded local penetrations, but no sustained breakout. By mid-March, withdrawals were ordered under pressure from Soviet counterattacks. In the process, the Waffen-SS leadership issued orders emphasizing discipline after vehicles were found mired and abandoned. Cuff titles were briefly removed as a sanction. The campaign concluded with a general pullback through western Hungary into Austria, followed by surrender to US forces in early May 1945. Prisoners and displaced civilians marked the immediate post-battle landscape. In Belgium and Luxembourg, American civil affairs units coordinated relief, reopened roads, and began compensation registries. Lists of missing were reconciled with cemetery records and POW returns. In Eastern Europe, Soviet authorities processed POWs through filtration camps, separating those suspected of crimes from regular troops. Civilians who had worked for German administrations underwent screening. Some were relocated, while others resumed local roles under new oversight. In both regions, winter conditions and destroyed infrastructure extended the humanitarian crisis into the spring. Fuel for heating was scarce. Food distribution relied on improvised depots, and rail repair lagged behind population movement. The legal aftermath began almost immediately in the Ardennes sector. US Army investigators gathered affidavits at Baugnies, Ligneuville, Stavelot, and nearby points from late December 1944 onward, preserving cartridge cases, mapping positions, and interviewing survivors under oath. Names of officers and units were compiled from captured documents and interrogation of POWs. These files formed the basis for charges brought in the Malmedy case before a US military court at Dachau in 1946. Defendants included officers and men from the Leibstandarte and associated units. Testimony detailed the movement of columns, the assembling of prisoners, and the subsequent shootings. The court issued a range of sentences, including death and life imprisonment. Subsequent reviews by US military authorities and later independent commissions re-examined interrogation methods and evidence handling, leading to commutations and reductions. Nonetheless, the core findings established responsibility for killings of prisoners during the offensive. For Dietrich personally, the end of hostilities brought arrest, interrogation, and court proceedings. He was taken into custody in 1945, appeared as a witness in several contexts, and stood trial in connection with the Malmedy case, receiving a sentence that was later reduced during review. Separate proceedings in West Germany in the 1950s examined events from the pre-war period and resulted in additional imprisonment. Throughout these stages, he presented himself as a field commander focused on operations, while prosecutors pointed to command positions, unit culture, and the pattern of incidents along formations under his authority. The evidentiary exchange included unit diaries, radio logs, survivor testimony, and post-war expert analysis of timelines. On the Eastern Front, Soviet legal processes proceeded through extraordinary commissions that compiled documentation for future war crimes trials. Files included village-level testimonies, burial records, and forensic reports, matched to German unit presence based on captured documents and POW statements. While not all cases proceeded to individual trials due to the mobility of units and the chaos of retreat, the archives created in 1943 to 1944 fixed many events to dates and localities, providing an alternative evidentiary base to Western proceedings. Some captured personnel were tried by Soviet tribunals and sentenced to prison terms or labor camps. Others were released after screening, depending on rank, role, and the availability of corroborated allegations. Operationally, the immediate consequence of both withdrawals was the reclassification of the Leibstandarte from an instrument of sustained offensive operations to a formation used in short commitments amid shrinking resources. The division's end-of-war returns show depleted battalions and dispersed remnants seeking to avoid capture by Soviet forces by moving west to surrender. Small groups crossed lines in late April and early May 1945, laying down arms near towns in Austria and Bavaria. Equipment was turned over at collection points, and personnel were processed into POW cages where screening teams separated potential witnesses and suspects for further questioning. For soldiers of all belligerents and the civilians among whom they fought, the aftermath meant reconstruction of basic life. In Kharkiv and neighboring regions, Soviet factories restarted under provisional quotas. Hospitals treated a mix of combat injuries and malnutrition. Schools reopened with reduced staff. In the Ardennes, Belgian authorities and Allied engineers rebuilt bridges and restored rail traffic, while legal offices filed claims based on property destruction and loss of life. Memorials began to appear by the late 1940s at sites where killings had been documented. The contrasting administrative systems, Soviet centralized recovery and Western Allied civil affairs, produced different timelines but similar priorities: shelter, food, transport, and the recording of what had happened. The withdrawal phase thus brought three simultaneous outcomes into the record. First, it confirmed the military limits of Dietrich's formations once opponents concentrated artillery, engineers, and reserves, and once fuel and maintenance shortages accumulated. Second, it exposed soldiers and civilians to the full cost of retreat, shortages, displacement, and the destructive measures used to delay pursuit. Third, it initiated the legal processes that would carry forward into peacetime, where combat logs and movement orders were read alongside testimonies from prisoners and inhabitants. These threads set the stage for the longer disputes over memory and responsibility that would emerge in the years after the war, shaping how later generations would interpret the balance between tactical reputation and the conduct recorded in investigative files. The long-term significance of Sepp Dietrich's career rests on two intertwined legacies that historians continue to assess with distinct evidentiary standards. One legacy is operational, a commander associated with mobile warfare, rapid concentration of force, and local recoveries at moments of crisis, notably around Kharkov in early 1943, and in the opening phase of the Ardennes in December 1944. The other is legal and institutional, a senior leader within the Waffen-SS, whose formations took part in killings of prisoners and civilians, village burnings, and enforcement of ideological directives in occupied territories. Post-war archives, German war diaries, Soviet and Allied operational records, security and police files, and courtroom exhibits allow both strands to be traced with increasing precision. The result is a layered picture that resists reduction to either a narrative of purely tactical excellence or one of undifferentiated criminality. Instead, it documents how both were produced by the same structures, orders, and conditions. In the immediate post-war years, Allied judicial processes and national memory projects advanced on parallel tracks. United States military courts assembled cases based on battlefield investigations in Belgium, captured documents and interrogations. Prosecutions established that prisoner shootings occurred along the routes of units subordinated to Dietrich during the Ardennes. Sentences were imposed, reviewed, and in many instances commuted as interrogation methods came under scrutiny and as Cold War politics shifted priorities. In West Germany, additional proceedings addressed earlier crimes, including political murders connected to regime consolidation. These produced finite prison terms that were served amid public debate over fairness and jurisdiction. Soviet extraordinary commissions, working through 1943 to 1947, compiled extensive records of burned settlements and executions in territories retaken from German forces. These dossiers fixed locations and dates and were later incorporated into national narratives and regional memorials. The broader debate about the Waffen-SS and the concept of a clean Wehrmacht evolved across decades. In the 1950s and 1960s, veterans associations sought legal rehabilitation and social recognition for former Waffen-SS personnel by stressing battlefield performance and downplaying security operations. Publications from these groups circulated claims that field divisions were separate from the SS police and camp system. Scholarly work, especially from the late 1970s onward, compared orders, personnel rosters, and movement logs, and showed overlap in doctrine, leadership networks, and enforcement tasks between front-line and rear area formations. Studies of the Commissar Order, anti-partisan directives, and reprisals in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia established that many field units, including those celebrated for tactical skill, operated within legal frameworks that permitted summary measures against categories of enemies and civilians. The contention over terminology, elite soldiers versus political troops, thus narrowed to testable propositions about command responsibility, unit presence, and the interpretation of orders. Dietrich's individual reputation was shaped by these currents. Within Waffen-SS circles, he remained a symbol of camaraderie and forward leadership, reinforced by memoirs and reunion culture. In professional military literature, assessments of his tactical role emphasized his ability to push formations during crises, while also noting his unconventional staff background and dependence on subordinate planners. Legal historians framed him within debates about superior responsibility, how far a commander is accountable for crimes committed by subordinates dispersed Kampfgruppen under fluid conditions, and what constitutes due diligence in prevention and punishment. The documentary trail, orders of the day, disciplinary logs, post-action reports, provides mixed signals, recording logistical urgencies and operational aims, far more often than explicit prohibitions or sanctions for violations. Courts and commissions filled evidentiary gaps with timelines and testimonies, establishing responsibility in specific instances without implying omnipotent control by any single headquarters. In both German states after 1949, public commemoration generated divergent frameworks. In the Federal Republic, early narratives emphasized rebuilding and the sacrifices of soldiers, while legal processes and historical scholarship gradually expanded the scope of acknowledged crimes. The emergence of a new army, the Bundeswehr, drew on Wehrmacht operational traditions while excluding Waffen-SS lineages from formal honours, a policy periodically contested in local commemorations or veteran events. In the German Democratic Republic, official memory stressed anti-fascist resistance and prioritised narratives of liberation by the Red Army, integrating Soviet investigative materials into school curricula and public memorials. In Belgium and the Soviet successor states, local remembrance focused on specific sites, bridges, crossroads, village squares, where killings had been documented, tying national history to place-based memory. Internationally, Comparative studies of armored warfare use the same case studies that feed the legal record. Analyses of Kharkov 1943 highlight the coordination of armor, infantry, engineers, and artillery under severe constraints. Accounts of the Ardennes 1944 examine operational surprise and the interplay of terrain, engineers, artillery, and air power. In both, Dietrich's formations serve as data points in larger models of how mechanized forces perform when fuel, road capacity, and weather become decisive variables. The same sources are then reinterpreted in legal and ethical frameworks to establish how doctrine and command culture influenced conduct toward prisoners and civilians. This dual use of evidence, tactical and juridical, demands disciplined separation of questions, while recognizing that both concern the same actors, dates, and places. By the late 20th century, wider access to archives and the publication of annotated document collections enabled more granular reconstructions. Researchers matched unit field post numbers with village testimonies and mapped columns against bridge demolition logs. The composite picture shows that the Leibstandarte and other SS Panzer divisions could achieve short-term operational successes through concentration and speed, but that these gains were framed by rules and assumptions that normalized extreme measures in rear areas and against designated enemy categories. The argument over whether battle efficiency can be judged separately from these practices has largely given way to studies that track how law, policy, and culture produced outcomes on both fronts. Tactical competence and criminal activity appear not as contradictory attributes, but as coexisting products of the same institutional environment. For soldiers and civilians who lived through the events, legacy has a tangible dimension. Survivors of prisoner shootings and village burnings provided testimonies that became part of local and national memory. Former members of Dietrich's formations wrote accounts emphasizing endurance and comradeship. Families on all sides traced lost relatives through cemetery records and POW archives. Memorials and museums at Kharkiv, in the Ardennes, and in cities where trials were held present curated narratives that reflect evolving scholarship and public sensibilities. These spaces do not deliver a single verdict. They document how interpretations changed as new sources were opened and as post-war politics receded. Sepp Dietrich's place in history therefore remains defined by the convergence of operational records and criminal evidence. He commanded units that executed ambitious armoured manoeuvres and appeared at critical junctures of the war, and he held authority within an organisation whose legal norms accommodated repression and enabled crimes. Courts imposed punishments that were later reduced. He was released in the mid-1950s and later faced additional proceedings in West Germany. The overarching lesson for historians is methodological rather than moral. Separate claims, test them against specific documents, and situate decisions within the structures that made them possible. In doing so, the narrative that once divided soldierly honour from atrocity becomes a study of how the same command chains produced both the battlefield actions that entered operational textbooks and the violations that entered trial transcripts.